Chapter 17. "Jem," I said, "are those the Yules sitting down yonder?" "Hush," said Jem, "Mr. Heck Tate's testifying." Mr. Tate had dressed for the occasion. He wore an ordinary business suit, which made him look somehow like every other man. Gone were his high boots, lumber jacket, and bullet-studded belt. From that moment he ceased to terrify me. He was sitting forward in the witness chair, his hands clasped between his knees, listening attentively to the circuit solicitor. The solicitor, a Mr. Gilmer, was not well known to us. He was from Abbotsville. We saw him only when court convened, and that rarely, for court was of no special interest to Jem and me. A balding, smooth-faced man, he could have been anywhere between 40 and 60. Although his back was to us, we knew he had a slight cast in one of his eyes, which he used to his advantage. He seemed to be looking at a person when he was actually doing nothing of the kind. Thus he was hell on juries and witnesses. The jury, thinking themselves under close scrutiny, paid attention. So did the witnesses, thinking likewise. "In your own words, Mr. Tate," Mr. Gilmer was saying. "Well," said Mr. Tate, touching his glasses and speaking to his knees. "I was called. Could you say it to the jury, Mr. Tate? Thank you." "Who called you?" Mr. Tate said, "I was fetched by Mr. Bob Yule yonder one night." "What night, sir?" Mr. Tate said, "It was the night of November 21st. I was just leaving my office to go home when Mr. Yule came in, very excited he was, and said to get out to his house quick. Some nigger had raped his girl." "Did you go?" "Certainly. Got in the car and went out as fast as I could." "And what did you find?" "Found her lying on the floor in the middle of the front room. One on the right as you go in. She was pretty well beat up, but I heaved her to her feet, and she washed her face in a bucket in the corner, and she said she was all right. I asked her who hurt her, and she said it was Tom Robinson." Judge Taylor, who'd been concentrating on his fingernails, looked up as if expecting an objection, but Atticus was quiet. "Asked her if he beat her like that. She said yes, he had. Asked her if he took advantage of her, and she said yes, he did. So I went down to Robinson's house and brought him back. She identified him as the one, so I took him in. That's all there was to it." "Thank you," said Mr. Gilmer. Judge Taylor said, "Any questions, Atticus?" "Yes," said my father. He was sitting behind his table. His chair was skewed to one side. His legs were crossed, and one arm was resting on the back of his chair. "Did you call a doctor, Sheriff?" "Did anyone call a doctor?" asked Atticus. "No, sir," said Mr. Tate. "Didn't call a doctor?" "No, sir," repeated Mr. Tate. "Why not?" There was an edge to Atticus's voice. "Well, I can tell you why I didn't. It wasn't necessary, Mr. Finch. She was mighty banged up. Something sure happened. It was obvious." "But you didn't call a doctor. While you were there, did anyone send for one, fetch one, carry her to one?" "No, sir." Judge Taylor broke in. "He answered the question 3 times, Atticus. He didn't call a doctor." Atticus said, "I just wanted to make sure, Judge," and the judge smiled. Jem's hand, which was resting on the balcony rail, tightened around it. He drew in his breath suddenly. Glancing below, I saw no corresponding reaction and wondered if Jem was trying to be dramatic. Dill was watching peacefully, and so was Reverend X behind him. "What is it?" I whispered, and got a terse "Shh." "Sheriff," Atticus was saying, "you say she was mighty banged up. In what way?" "Well, just describe her injuries, Heck." "Well, she was beaten round the head. There was already bruises coming on her arms. It had happened about 30 minutes before." "How do you know?" Mr. Tate grinned. "Sorry, that's what they said. Anyway, she was pretty bruised up when I got there, and she had a black eye coming." "Which eye?" Mr. Tate blinked and ran his hand through his hair. "Let's see," he said softly. Then he looked at Atticus as if he considered the question childish. "Can't you remember?" Atticus asked. Mr. Tate pointed to an invisible person 5 inches in front of him and said, "Her left." "Wait a minute, Sheriff," said Atticus. "Was it her left facing you, or her left looking the same way you were?" Mr. Tate said, "Oh, yes, that'd make it her right. It was her right eye, Mr. Finch. I remember now, she was bunged up on that side of her face." Mr. Tate blinked again, as if something had suddenly been made plain to him. Then he turned his head and looked around at Tom Robinson. As if by instinct, Tom Robinson raised his head. Something had been made plain to Atticus also, and it brought him to his feet. "Sheriff, please repeat what you said." "It was her right eye," I said. "No." Atticus walked to the court reporter's desk and bent down to the furiously scribbling hand. It stopped, flipped back the shorthand pad, and the reporter said, "Mr. Finch, I remember now. She was bunged up on that side of her face." Atticus looked up at Mr. Tate. "Which side again, Heck?" "The right side, Mr. Finch. But she had more bruises. You want to hear about 'em?" Atticus seemed to be bordering on another question, but he thought better of it and said yes. What were her other injuries? As Mr. Tate answered, Atticus turned and looked at Tom Robinson, as if to say this was something they hadn't bargained for. "Her arms were bruised, and she showed me her neck. There were definite finger marks on her gullet." "All around her throat, at the back of her neck?" "I'd say they were all around, Mr. Finch." "You would?" Yes, sir, she had a small throat. Anybody could have reached around it with, "Just answer the question, yes or no, please, Sheriff," said Atticus dryly, and Mr. Tate fell silent. Atticus sat down and nodded to the circuit solicitor, who shook his head at the judge, who nodded to Mr. Tate, who rose stiffly and stepped down from the witness stand. Below us, heads turned, feet scraped the floor, babies were shifted to shoulders, and a few children scampered out of the courtroom. The Negroes behind us whispered softly among themselves. Dill was asking Reverend Sykes what it was all about, but Reverend Sykes said he didn't know. So far, things were utterly dull. Nobody had thundered. There was no arguments between opposing counsel. There was no drama. A grave disappointment to all present, it seemed. Atticus was proceeding amiably, as if he were involved in a title dispute. With his infinite capacity for calming turbulent seas, he could make a rape case as dry as a sermon. Gone was the terror in my mind of stale whiskey and barnyard smells, of sleepy-eyed sullen men, of a husky voice calling in the night. "Mr. Finch, they gone?" Our nightmare had gone with daylight. Everything would come out all right. All the spectators were as relaxed as Judge Taylor, except Jem. His mouth was twisted into a purposeful half-grin, and his eyes happy about, and he said something about corroborating evidence, which made me sure he was showing off. "Robert E. Lee Ewell." In answer to the clerk's booming voice, a little bantam cock of a man rose and strutted to the stand, the back of his neck reddening at the sound of his name. When he turned around to take the oath, we saw that his face was as red as his neck. We also saw no resemblance to his namesake. A shock of wispy, new-washed hair stood up from his forehead. His nose was thin, pointed, and shiny. He had no chin to speak of. It seemed to be part of his crepey neck. "So help me God," he crowed. Every town the size of Maycomb had families like the Ewells. No economic fluctuation changed their status. People like the Ewells lived as guests of the county in prosperity as well as in the depths of the Depression. No truant officers could keep their numerous offspring in school. No public health officer could free them from congenital defects, various worms, and the diseases indigenous to filthy surroundings. Maycomb's Ewells lived near the town garbage dump in what was once a Negro cabin. The cabin's plank walls were supplemented with sheets of corrugated iron, its roof shingled with tin cans hammered flat, so only its general shape suggested its original design. Square with 4 tiny rooms opening into a shotgun hall. The cabin rested uneasily upon 4 irregular lumps of limestone. Its windows were merely open spaces in the walls, which in the summertime were covered with greasy strips of cheesecloth to keep out the varmints that feasted on Maycomb's refuse. The varmints had a lean time of it, for the Ewells gave the dump a thorough cleaning every day, and the fruit of their industry, those that were not eaten, made the plot of ground around the cabin look like the playhouse of an insane child. What passed for a fence was bits of tree limbs, broomsticks, and tool shafts, all tipped with rusty hammerheads. Snaggletooth raked heads, shovels, axes, and grubbing hose held on with pieces of barbed wire. Enclosed by this barricade was a dirty yard containing the remains of a Model T Ford on blocks, a discarded dentist chair, an ancient icebox, plus lesser items, old shoes, worn-out table radios, picture frames, and fruit jars, under which scrawny orange chickens pecked hopefully. One corner of the yard, though, bewildered Maycomb. Against the fence, in a line, were 6 chipped enamel slop jars holding brilliant red geraniums, cared for as tenderly as if they belonged to Miss Maudie Atkinson. Had Miss Maudie deigned to permit of geranium on her premises, people said they were Mayella Ewells. Nobody was quite sure how many children were on the place. Some people said 6, others said 9. There were always several dirty-faced ones at the windows when anyone passed by. Nobody had occasion to pass by except at Christmas, when the churches delivered baskets, and when the mayor of Maycomb asked us to please help the garbage collector by dumping our own trees and trash. Atticus took us with him last Christmas when he complied with the mayor's request. A dirt road ran from the highway past the dump down to a small Negro settlement some 500 yards beyond the Ewells. It was necessary either to back out on the highway or go the full length of the road and turn around. Most people turned around in the Negroes' front yards. In the frosty December dusk, their cabins looked neat and snug, with pale blue smoke rising from the chimneys and doorways glowing amber from the fires inside. There were delicious smells about, chicken, baking, frying, crisp as the twilight air. Jem and I detected squirrel cooking, but it took an old countryman like Atticus to identify possum and rabbit, aromas that vanished when we rode back past the Ewell residence. All the little man on the witness stand had that made him any better than his nearest neighbors was that if he scrubbed with lye soap in very hot water, his skin was white. "Mr. Robert Ewell?" asked Mr. Gilmer. "That's my name, Captain," said the witness. Mr. Gilmer's back stiffened a little, and I felt sorry for him. Perhaps I'd better explain something now. I've heard that lawyers' children, on seeing their parents in court in the heat of an argument, get the wrong idea. They think opposing counsel to be the personal enemies of their parents. They suffer agonies and are surprised to see them often go out arm in arm with their tormentors during the first recess. This was not true of Jem and me. We acquired no traumas from watching our father win or lose. I'm sorry that I can't provide any drama in this respect. If I did, it wouldn't be true. We could tell, however, when debate became more acrimonious than professional, but this was from watching lawyers other than our father. I never heard Atticus raise his voice in my life, except to a deaf witness. Mr. Gilmer was doing his job as Atticus was doing his. Besides, Mr. Ewell was Mr. Gilmer's witness, and he had no business being rude to him of all people. Are you the father of Mayella Ewell? Was the next question. Well, if I ain't, I can't do nothing about it now. Her ma's dead, was the answer. Judge Taylor stirred. He turned slowly in his swivel chair and looked benignly at the witness. Are you the father of Mayella Ewell? He asked, in a way that made the laughter below us stop suddenly. Yes, sir, Mr. Ewell said meekly. Judge Taylor went on in tones of goodwill. This is the first time you've ever been in court? I don't recall ever seeing you here. At the witness's affirmative nod, he continued. Well, let's get something straight. There will be no more audibly obscene speculations on any subject from anybody in this courtroom as long as I'm sitting here. Do you understand? Mr. Ewell nodded, but I don't think he did. Judge Taylor sighed and said, All right, Mr. Gilmer. Thank you, sir. Mr. Ewell, would you please tell us in your own words what happened on the evening of November 21st, please?